When I started work in 1978, 82% of British workers were covered by a collective agreement. Today, as I get close to the end of my working life, that figure has fallen to what some people estimate being 23% of workers covered by a collective agreement. Now, in our view, as John Hendy and myself, in our view, that is a crisis. It is a crisis for collective bargaining, but it's a crisis for trade unionism. The one thing that trade unions do, the one thing that only trade unions can do, is to bargain collectively on behalf of their members. It is crucial to the future of trade unionism that this level of coverage is addressed and that the decline is stopped, and that we begin to look again at something like the European norm, where more than 50% of our workers are covered by a collective agreement. We've got two problems. One is the problem of inequality, and the other is the problem of stagnating living conditions. Everybody agrees, whether it be the OECD, the IMF, various institutions think we need to change this. We've got to raise wages, reduce the inequality gap.
There are several really powerful reasons why collective bargaining ought to be reinstated at the centre stage of industrial relations in Britain today. The first reason, which is the most significant for us as lawyers, is that the duty to promote collective bargaining is a provision found in all the key international human rights treaties, all of which have been ratified by the United Kingdom, all of which are binding on the United Kingdom. It would be tedious to list them, but we're talking about International Labour Organization Convention number 98, we're talking about the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, we're talking about the European Social Charter, and above all we're talking about the European Convention on Human Rights, which in a landmark decision in 2008 held that the duty to promote collective bargaining, or the right to collective bargaining, was a fundamental aspect of freedom of association, which is part of Article 11 of the European Convention. So as a matter of law, the duty to promote collective bargaining is a duty on all the governments of the world, and in particular all the European governments, and in particular the United Kingdom, the duty to promote collective bargaining. There are other reasons why collective bargaining is fundamental as well. Reasons of social justice. It's the only way that workers can have an effective voice at work is through collective bargaining. And of course we all know, everybody accepts that workers in relation to employers have an imbalance of power against them. So this is collective bargaining is the way to redress that.
There are so many problems that we face that could be dealt with properly and effectively by collective bargaining, rather than by developing new legal instruments and new forms of legislation, new opportunities for litigation. The best way to deal with problems like the living wage, to deal with the problem of 0 hours contracts, to deal with the problem of working time generally, the problem of grievances and discipline at the workplace, would be to have proper collective agreements with proper procedures for resolving disputes as and when they arise. That must be a better way forward than more and more legislation and more litigation.
We're talking about the economic arguments, but there's one particular facet of that perhaps might be developed, which is the issue of inequality. We're in a society which is growing more unequal by the day, and research which has been done by Wilkinson and Pickett and Hayes and Novich shows that if you have effective collective bargaining, effective sectoral collective bargaining on an industry-wide basis covering the bulk of the nation's workers, you get less inequality. And that means that you don't get all the horrible things that go with inequality, rising crime rate, rates, drug dependency, diminished life expectancy amongst the poor, and so forth and so on. So that's another reason why it's vital that we restore collective bargaining to pre-existing levels.
Question is, how are we going to do it? The work I've done with John Hendy, I mean, I think we have taken the view that we need to go back to the past to learn how to deal with the future. And we go back to a period when we've been here before, in a sense, back to the 1930s, and we had another economic crisis. How were we going to get out of this crisis? Government of the day decided, well, in a sense, we've got to raise wages, we've got to equalise incomes, we've got to stimulate demand, we've got to reduce social security budgets, increase public services. The only way we can do that is through the institutions of collective bargaining. And as a result of that, the government of the day, which we have to say was not a Labour government, decided that the best way forward was to rebuild the collective bargaining institutions that had been allowed to decay in the 1920s and early 1930s in order to raise wages. When we're looking at the 1930s, I think it's important to remember that this policy had been initiated by a coalition government. The minister in question was a guy called Ernest Brown, who was a Liberal. But of course it was Ernest Bevin, the great trade unionist, who in the 1940s, as Minister of Labour, took it forward and took us to a level of collective bargaining coverage of 86%. But it wasn't just in this country that steps were taken for economic and social reasons to promote collective bargaining, but the same happened in the United States and in France and in various other countries around the world. And that was a very, very successful initiative in the sense that what they did was to build up joint industrial councils which created sector-wide collective bargaining throughout the industries of this country, so that within about 14, 15 years, we had a situation in this country where 86%, that's 86% of British workers, were covered by a collective agreement. Now that is very, very important because it means that workers throughout the country had proper protection, their wages were set at a decent level, their terms and conditions were set at a decent level, and that actually sustained and survived until the Thatcher era in the beginning in 1979. What is the agenda for Labour? Well, it seems to us that it's pretty straightforward. Two things. One is we need to rediscover the role for a Ministry of Labour at the heart of government. For us, it is essential that the 29 million workers of this country have a voice at the cabinet table. That can only be done if there is a dedicated government department there to represent their interests in the government machine. Secondly, that government department must have the responsibility to rebuild the collective bargaining machinery which has been allowed to decline in this country. What that means is that it must be an initiative of a new Ministry of Labour to re-establish sector-wide collective bargaining so that we get back to the position where at least a majority of British workers are covered by a collective agreement.